Oh, welcome. Welcome on behalf of the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy and its president, Nancy Stevenson, who's hiding in the corner. Our speaker is the brilliant editor-in-chief of Econoview, which widely publishes economic news and analyses. Lyric Hughes Hale is an author, a lecturer, at prominent institutions, business executive, and throughout a lifelong student of the world from on the ground. She has lived in Europe, Japan, and Iran, and first went to China in 1979. She founded China Online, which published business news on the web. Hers is an extraordinary career, which I have observed as a longtime friend of hers and her late, also brilliant husband, David. She taught me about China, its economy, even the role of silver in China's economy. Lyric's perspective is from within the world and its history. We are very grateful to Lyric for sharing it with us today. Lyric has agreed to take your questions, after which we will adjourn to home for socializing and refreshments. Thank you, Lyric.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Turn this on now first, or I'm okay?
Yep.
I need to turn it on? Or I'm okay? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Adlai. And also very nice to see Ken Dam in the audience, who helped me to edit our book that was mentioned, and Marcia, and of course Nancy. So many friends here. Thank you for coming on a beautiful September day. So because the topic is sort of big, I took the unusual, in fact, the first time in my life, step of writing down what I wanted to say so that I can get most of it in, or some of it in, to give you a perspective on the world. I am not an economist, but I'm definitely an economic commentator, an economic journalist. So I'm not a participant like Adlai or Ken and Marcia and Nancy have been, but I'm an observer. And so I'm hoping to share some of my observations of how the world is working. What I do all day is try to figure that question out. So I'm going to be very happy to take your questions and to have a discussion afterwards. So thank you for inviting me. I think really the Adlai Stevenson Center for Democracy has even a more important role to play today when democracy, and particularly free speech, is in danger not around the world. So I think this effort, which began, I guess, in 2008, is that right, Nancy? I think, I hope that it continues and grows and spreads, which I know it will, thanks to your efforts, too. I read a little about the founding of the center, and I saw a quote there from Adlai's father. And the quote is, "A free society is a society in which it is safe to be unpopular." So my goal is not to be unpopular today, but my goal is to be iconoclastic and to break apart some of the assumptions that you might have about how the world works. So one of my favorite bands is called The National. Nobody in this room listens to them. You know, the advantage of having kids is they sometimes cross-pollinate with the things that are important to them in their culture. And they have a song that's called False Empire. And my favorite line there is, "We are all living in a false empire." And that phrase sticks in my mind quite a bit recently. And I think that that because of our prejudices and assumptions, I think it's causing us not to understand the world the way it really is, and that means that we're not making the right decisions. Speaking of assumptions, that brings me to economists. And economists, since the great financial crisis, have really been struggling So I go to the American Economics Association meetings, and everything is about before and after the financial crisis of 2007 and 2008. And the biggest question people have, and the one they struggle to answer, is why didn't they, including the Queen of England, by the way, ask this question, why didn't they see what was coming? What was wrong that they didn't get it? And the answer from my point of view is economists are not forecasters. Economists are really very good quantitative historians. They're very good at looking at what happened and figuring out patterns. But the world is not a static place. And as it's changing, it becomes harder and harder to make prognostications of any kind. So I don't think we should blame them that they can't figure out what's happening. There are just so many things, politics, technology, natural disasters, that no one really can foresee. And if they say they can, they're lying. So the surer they are of their forecast, the more worried I would be when you listen to somebody. You know, back in 1992, I don't know if you remember, Frank Fukuyama wrote a book called The End of History, right? And the conclusion of that book was that we had reached a steady state of a liberal democracy, and then things were going to be wonderful. And actually in 92, it kind of felt great. Too. Things seemed to be going very well. But he was very wrong. And the fact is that I feel today that we are living still in the aftermath of World War II, and that the decisions that were taken right after World War II are still affecting us today. And I'll give the best example I can possibly give you is North Korea. A lot of people think North Korea and South Korea were separated during the Korean War. And I'll defer to Adlai on all of these questions later. But actually, Korea was, for the first time in its history, split into two parts by the Russians and the Americans in 1946. Otherwise, Korea today would have been a whole country. And of course, the same thing happened to Germany. And look at how they had to fight back for reunification. But Korea still has not, obviously, been reunified. So the lessons, I think, to take away from this is that this idea that we had, that kind of Frank Fukuyama's idea of this borderless world, frictionless, is just, it's not happening. And in fact, things are happening in the reverse. If you look at Spain, Catalonia wants independence, for example. There's Kurdistan. These are elections that are going on, things that are happening just this week. People don't want any more. They don't believe in this idea of a globalized world. And what caused them? How did that get them to that place? Neil Ferguson, the historian, has a great piece today in the Times of London I'd really recommend to you. And he describes why he thinks that this happened, this reversal of fortune of the idea of globalization took place. And he talks about Brexit as another good example of that. And says that nuclear weapons, as borders have become more important, what is the ultimate border guard is not a wall, not a transparent wall, but but a bomb, a nuclear bomb. So that's, and so I think based on that, if that's true, you could assume that nuclear proliferation will continue and spread, not that we will disarm. So that would be a takeaway of that. Right here in Chicago, we have Raghuram Rajan, who used to be the central bank governor of India, a really brilliant thinker. And I saw him make a speech a couple of months ago at the IMF meetings, at the World Bank meetings. And he said he thinks as well that rather than borderless, people are going in the opposite direction to wanting to have more and more local control over their destinies. So, and again, the example of Brexit, why are we going to let people in Brussels decide how we grow tomatoes? It doesn't make sense to us. We want to be able to decide based upon our own culture, which is another very important word, our own culture, our own history, how we're going to do things. And we want them to be accountable. So how does that affect other things? Well, For example, the Paris Accord, the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Now, a lot of things you read about in the media, but if you actually go to look at documents, they're much different than what you expected. If you bother to do the research, which I was taught at University of Chicago, always go to primary sources. So I did. I looked at the agreement, and what is amazing about it is the number of local agreements there are, sub-agreements, under the main agreement. So the Russian one is very fascinating because, yes, Russia signed the agreement, but guess what? None of the restrictions apply to energy, the energy industry, which is their main industry. That's excluded. And you can go through. So all those individual countries negotiated separate agreements that fit their own terms. So the fact that we don't participate or not, to me, I'm not sure how really important or really relevant. It's not as if everybody agreed to the same rules. Right. They didn't in the first place. That's not what that agreement is. So people are losing faith in these agreements, even though they have in those kind of organizations, even though it appears that they're compliant, in actual fact, they're not. And this is serious. Why is it serious, and why is it important for us to have faith in international institutions? The best example I can think of is the World Health Organization, because what could really come to whack us in the head would be some kind of an epidemic. And the World Health Organization is funded, if you knew how little money they have and how much faith people have that they would be able to do something to stop an epidemic, you would be truly frightened. And Lori Garrett, who is at the Council on Foreign Relations, is a wonderful person to read about how fragile our health ecosystem is around the world. And it's one of those things where it's only the weakest link that matters, right, to create true catastrophe. So I'm going to be citing a lot of papers and people and so forth, so don't worry about keeping track of it, because I'll send a copy of the links to Nancy later, if you'd like. Mm-hmm.
We'll put them on our website.
Thank you. And also you can find them on EconView, but in various places you'll be able to find them there. Okay, so what was supposed to be happening? Particularly the hope was that trade would increase. Global supply chains would create a frictionless world where you could get any kind of goods that you wanted very cheaply. And then now economists are talking about how that really rolled out. And we see the effects in our political system, in our elections as well, that it didn't quite work that way, that there were winners and losers. So there are several studies now that show that in those towns, for example, in the United States, that lost manufacturing to China or Indonesia or wherever it was, that not only do they have long-lasting economic effects, even their health is affected. And so now that the life expectancy of white males overall in the United States for the first time is decreasing. Can you imagine that? In the richest country in the world. So there are effects, and it's hard to say where they are. We also have an opioid epidemic too that's contributing to that. But where does that come? That despair, where people give up. And some of that has to do with the imbalances, I think, of world trade. And that had a lot of political resonance in the last election. Also, really, the idea that trade keeps people from fighting is incorrect. There was a famous economist in I think the 1930s, Wayne Angell, and he said that wasn't true, and there are a lot of examples. So I'm going to ask you, well, who were the biggest trading partners of the United Kingdom and Germany prior to the outbreak of World War I? Any guesses? Each other. Oh. Not the United States. So even though they were so entwined economically, it doesn't mean that they did the rational thing. They still went to war. So nations, just like people, sometimes commit suicide. They do things that are really not rational, maybe not in their short-term or long-term best interests. So added to that, there's a new line of thinking, in economics that's been promulgated by this is very new, Luigi Zingales. Ken, I imagine you know who he is, but he's an economist at Booth as well. But he's written that he doesn't think the nation state rules the world anymore at all anyway. So this construct we have of governments being the things that rule our lives is incorrect. And he's creating a theory that corporations are actually much more important than individual countries. And his examples are the amount of lobbying and the amount of money that's spent on lobbying in Washington, and how regulations are so complicated that that the government doesn't have the resources and elected officials to study all these questions the way they should, and innovations are taking place so quickly that private industry supplies them with the data that they use to make decisions. And so this is just a developing theory, but the more I think about it, the more I think that this idea of multinationals as a separate force is really, really intriguing. Regulatory people are always lagging the people who are creating things. Why? Because if the regulators could create those things, they'd be creators, not regulators. So that's, with the financial crisis, the financial innovations that took place were not dreamed up or even foreseen by they couldn't even imagine that they would do things like that, but they did. So they're always sweeping up behind. And, that's definitely going to continue. The internet was thought of as another place where we would be able to avoid borders, right, and create a borderless world. And my company, China Online, was mentioned in one of Tom Friedman's books as an example of how a place where there was censorship could be overcome by internet media. But I even then felt that actually this centralization of information would create just the opposite. Actually, the internet, and in a place like China, telecommunications, it's created a place where you can find out everything about anybody. So before, if I would, write a letter to you, and then you decide, I'm going to throw that letter away, you tear it up, no one will ever see it. But if I email you that same information, basically, it's there forever. It's there forever, and we're all learning that, the hard way. Reaction, I think in the technological world, the reaction that you're seeing to this is one of the solutions is blockchain technology, and you probably have seen a lot of discussion about it. But I don't think in the end, and I spent a lot of time studying blockchain, and I'm kind of a techie nerd in spite of myself, but I think that the ability of blockchain to scale is very limited right now. It's technologically limited because what it's doing is creating a distributed network, an untrusted distributed network where everybody has every piece of information, but you don't know whose it is. There are a lot of issues that have to do with blockchain and also cryptocurrencies, which now in China, recently Bitcoin and so forth, they're all, of course, central banks and central governments don't want an unregulated currency where nobody knows who owns it and who got it. There's no way to tax it. There's no way to trace it. So there's going to be a regulatory reaction to it, but I think in the end there will be ways of establishing value, that there will be ways of, and those are the companies to watch, the ones who will create privacy and security. Those are going to be the scarce goods that we look for in the 21st century. So, something like Facebook right now owns all of the data that you put in there. In the future, people will not want to share their data, to have somebody else own it, and moreover, profit from it. So we all put our information there, including me. Facebook takes it, makes ads, and it's created a huge concentration of wealth in the stocks, for example, that are in that area, Amazon as well. So, now the media, though, in general, I am not going to join the chorus of people blaming the media for everything because I don't think it's true. And in fact, I think the media, strangely enough, is improving. It's just that the authority that the media used to have, the centralization that the media represented, is now being, we're in a period of creative destruction. So I don't know about you, but I don't go to individual news websites anymore. I create a Twitter feed, and the news sites that I want to follow, or the people whose opinions I value, especially those people who don't agree with me, because that's most valuable to me, I have them in my feed. So when I wake up in the morning, I go to my Twitter account, and I don't follow Donald Trump, because so many other people will post about him, I don't need to. But I go through there, and I have my own personalized news feed, which includes Russian, Chinese, Japanese, French, Italian, the other languages that I can read, and Persian. So I get something that is not available anyplace else. And a lot of people, I think are doing the same thing. So local, I don't know if you've seen patch in your individual neighborhoods. There's a Highland Park patch and a Lake Forest patch. Very, very local news. So I think we're going to get, again, from some authority who knows everything, to really local. Politics, really local. Media, really local, lots of stuff, including manufacturing, when you have manufacturing that is a new type of manufacturing on demand that will be occurring in the future. So, I think I was watching, I brought the Super Bowl to China, so I'm always interested in football. But recently I've been really concerned reading about traumatic brain injury. I can't really enjoy it, I think, the way that I used to because of what I know now happens to people. So I thought, the NFL was so brilliant. They hoisted President Trump on his own petard because instead of getting people focused on what I was worried about, now they're all talking about people kneeling and patriotism and all of that, and there's been a lot of support for the NFL. I thought that was masterful. But usually I think Trump has been masterful at he's been very, very smart about how he's used the media. He doesn't need to go to the editorial board of a newspaper like you used to have to do. He can just say what he wants to say directly to whomever he wants to say it to, anywhere in the world except China, where they don't get Twitter. But I think it's a really revolutionary type of thing that's going on, very fascinating to me. So what are the things that are puzzling economists? I'm trying to give you a different view of the world, but what are the things that are puzzling economists right now? What doesn't fit in to classical economics anymore? And there are two big puzzles, and you have really smart people on both sides of the picture. The first is productivity. Why is productivity not increasing the way that it did up through the 1970s? What has happened? Don't we have all these gadgets now? Isn't it so much easier to reach people? Can't we communicate? Why is productivity low? And productivity is a very complicated thing, but one book I would highly recommend is Bob Gordon, who's economics professor at Northwestern. He wrote a book and it's called The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And his viewpoint is that, bless you, okay, sorry.
Rise and fall of what?
Sorry?
Rise and fall of what?
Oh, you didn't hear it, of the rise and fall of American growth. So his thesis is that productivity has stopped because the inventions of the early 20th century, late 19th, earliest 20th century, up through the 1970s, were much more important than the inventions that we're having now. So, example, railroads had a much bigger effect on the economy. Electrification had a much bigger effect, that they were more profound. And now the things that we're doing are basically entertainment. And in fact, Facebook might sap your productivity for that matter, right? So that's really interesting. So I talked to him about that and I thought about it, but I think there's at least one area where he's wrong, that technology has stopped evolving or will stop evolving, and that's in medicine. because, healthcare is 18% of U.S. GDP right now. The last time I looked, maybe it's more in the last 6 months. But I think that once we have diagnostics and telemedicine and all of those things that are going to develop, you won't be able to stop them, that's going to have a very big effect on people's health. You'll be able to self-monitor all kinds of things, and not only here, but in less developed places where they don't have access to good health care, they'll be able to have access to good information and good advice. And that, I think, health is a huge drag on productivity. And we have that drag right now in the United States in terms of our health, in terms of both cost and in terms of people not being healthy. So I think that that's an exception, and it could be a really major exception. And also, I think human ingenuity is, you can't forecast that either. And things could happen. Driverless cars, I believe, will be the future too. That is definitely going to happen. And I think people around our age are going to benefit the most from it, or like my mother, because she doesn't want to drive her car anymore, but she would have loved to come here probably, and if she had had access to that, I bet she would have done it. So, and the people who are most unhappy about the idea of driverless cars, strangely enough, are young people ages 20 to 25. They're worried about it. They don't trust technology. So it's not what you expect. Okay, so that's the one puzzle, but the reality is productivity is low, and that's hurting our growth. The other puzzle is inflation, and that has all kinds of ramifications. Japan was first trying to lower interest rates and do everything. They spend their way to craziness, to bridges to nowhere, to try to boost inflation. They were never able to do it. And now central banks around the world, it's the same thing. So there's discussion, should we lower the inflation target? Should it not be 2%? Should it be 1.5%? What is the problem with that? They went so far, to me, overboard into new territory with what they call quantitative easing. Quantitative easing is just buying assets of various kinds, debt instruments, equities, and Japan's central bank, which is itself a publicly traded company, by the way, they buy majority shares in a huge number of companies. So they're entwined with the system. They're not separate and apart from it. They're with it. So right now, it's estimated that there is $20 trillion on the balance sheets of central banks around the world. That's real money, 20 trillion. So Janet Yellen just announced that she's going to start unwinding that. So depending on how, but the thing is, nobody's ever done that before. So nobody ever had negative interest rates before. Nobody ever unwound something like that. So if she does something like $10 billion a month, it probably won't make a ripple. But if she does something that's too aggressive, it could really rock markets. I think getting that those policy choices just right, I don't envy her or whoever replaces her when her term's up in February. I think it's going to be really, really difficult. On the other hand, there are people who feel that this is what has led to a lot of inequality in our own country, these low interest rates. Because, if you have a good credit rating, that's great for you because you can borrow money at a very low interest rate and you can make money. But if you have bad credit, or no, you can't. If you have student loans, if you have credit card debt, what the Federal Reserve, if they raise 25 basis points, it makes zero difference in your life and in your debt load. And overall debt all over the world has increased too. China's debt, overall debt since the financial crisis 10 years ago has doubled. U.S. corporate debt since 10 years ago has doubled. That's because the rates are so low, it's like irresistible. But if the interest rates go back up again, that's when you're going to be in a danger zone once more. How are you going to know? What is the timing of all this going to be? So there's somebody wonderful to read on this subject, and her name is Karen Petru with Federal Financial Analytics. And she's written about how this central bank policy being extended for this period of time. She has a lot of data about how that created additional inequality. But I used some of her data. I just did some back of the envelope, calculations, which is at the beginning of the financial crisis, 67% of Americans, I believe, owned shares. They owned stock or equities of some sort. Today, it's 52%. So that's a big change. And what that means is people who lost money or had to cash out their IRAs in order to pay their mortgage, they never recovered, they never went back in the market. The people who were better off and were able to stay, in the market or were able to actually increase their holdings, they did very well. So the additional, the state of the market, the valuation of the market then, and now 10 years later, if you take the change in value and you divide that by the number of people who own shares, that means every man, woman, and child in a household that invested in the stock market and stayed invested increased their wealth by $50,000 on average. Okay? So on the other hand, if your major source of wealth is your home, that, unless you live in San Francisco or someplace like that, we know that it didn't have the same kind of run-up in value, right? In the meantime, young people who have student loans aren't able to get in at any price and at any valuation. So, also a very big danger sign is because wages have not been increasing. People, and even though inflation is low, people haven't been able to keep up with what they need to buy. And so credit cards are being charged up. And you'll see an uptick in HELOCs. People are once again, if they've even had a little bit of uptick in their mortgage, they're once again using their home as an ATM. Yeah. So that, to me, is a big danger sign.
Gary, speak up a little. We on the side
Are having trouble? Oh, I'm
Yes,
sorry.
speak up
Okay.
loud.
Okay.
Yes.
Should it be up here? Okay.
It's right over here.
Should I move this a little? I'm sorry. Marcia, you should have spoken up sooner.
I think, well, there's some blowing over here, which
Oh, sorry.
doesn't matter.
Okay, I'm not known for my booming voice. This is true. Okay, so final point. Now I can see I've disturbed everybody. I'm sorry. An immutable force in all of this that we have to pay attention to is demographics. And demographics is something you can forecast because you know how many people you have and what age they. It's much more forecastable than anything else. And the United Nations has a wonderful site on this. It's worth spending 30 minutes just tooling around to see the reality of how demographics is changing. By 2050, do you know that Nigeria will have a bigger population, will surpass the population of the United States?
Really?
Yes. We will be the fourth largest country after India, China, Nigeria, the United States. Yeah. And Africa, by the way, by 2100, 39% of the world's population will live in Africa. 39%. By 2050, only 1.2 billion people will live in the developed world. This kind of focuses your mind on the kind of world that we're going to have. Also, the only positive demographics, and by what I mean by that basically is more young people than old people, is the only place that's going to be true. We have a demographic time bomb in places like Japan, which will lose half its population by 2065. We have a demographic time bomb going on in China. Don't ever think they're going to surpass the United States economy. They have so many problems within that aging population. I don't think it's going to happen. And they will say that too. A lot of people will say that very, honestly. But it's going to be a different world. So Africa is the only continent that will have a positive demographic profile by 2050. So if you're investing in a region, I would say, also Africa is very unique from a technological standpoint, which is it's the best place in the world to have data centers where all this data pushed around because it's equidistant South Africa, South America, Europe, the United. It's a really great place to have data centers, and that's happening. Undersea cables are now encircling Africa. And guess who's building up the internal telecommunications network, though? China. Who is the biggest investor in Africa now? China. Exactly, because they're thinking. They're thinking ahead. And we're not there. We're basically not there. So anyway, I think it will be a whole new world. Imagine Africa as the technological center of the world in the future, and a world of driverless cars, a place where all your data will be private. There'll be extreme political and political decentralization, localization of media. All your devices will be attached to the Internet of Things, and all of your manufacturing and printing and publishing will be on demand. This is the kind of world that I'm trying to imagine to see where we're going. So anyway, wrapping it up, I think geopolitical, obviously we haven't even touched on all of these, but geopolitical and economic, especially policy failure risks, I think are increasing. I'm not a stock market forecaster in any way. I'm not a registered investment advisor. But for those of you who came in hoping that you would hear what the market might do, I have a couple quotes for you. The stock market, 83% of CFOs of major US corporations feel that the stock market is overvalued. And CFOs are not a crazy bunch of guys, and women. Also, Robert Shiller, who's an economist at Yale, who won the Nobel Prize and did the Case-Shiller index and all of that, he just a couple days ago wrote an article where he said, I see all the same factors as before all the other crashes present. Doesn't mean it will happen, but I see the same preconditions there. So, so I'm not an investor, but just I thought that was interesting that the drumbeats, people are getting worried. People are getting concerned. We heard this before, didn't we? House prices are going to keep going. There's nothing to stop them. And in China in August 2015, the People's Daily was saying there's no reason that the stock market can't keep growing. And if indeed corporations are running the world, maybe there's something to that. But maybe there's not. And maybe even though the world is different, maybe the same old rules apply. So I'd be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Questions now?
Yeah.
Any questions?
Yes. Yeah.
Recognize.
Yes, please.
Could you say a bit about the impact that you think what's going to be called behavioral economics, using findings from neuroscience and so forth, the impact that it will have on the belief in the rational market and how that might eventually be reflected in policy?
Okay. Even though I like Austin Goolsbee, personally, I would say that behavioral economics has been a disaster. So I'm sorry, but look at Obamacare. Because a lot of young people, what the idea was behind that was that that your behavior, it's easier to opt out than to opt in, for example. That's just a basic fact of human life. So you were supposed to get health care, and if you didn't, there was also a stick attached to that, which is that you would get you get money, a fine on your income tax. Lots and lots and lots of healthy young people would rather pay the fine than to get health insurance that's more expensive, that they don't foresee a use for. So I think behavioral economics is kind of it's a socialist mindset in a way, and I wonder if it really works. What are the positive examples, of it? We know that neuroscience tells us that we invest irrationally, too, that's not irrational. I think it's very interesting, but I think you'd have to be very careful about making policy decisions based on it. Yeah. Yes? Mm-hmm.
In terms of Africa as it grows, can will their educational system, what will their human services system look like in terms of health, education? If you have a vast population, how will they really manage that?
That's a very good question. Problem is, Africa's not a country. It's a lot of countries. And there's nothing like the European Union to to pull it together. So the answer has to be country by country, right, to decide. And I think it's with the corruption, even in a place like South Africa, look at Zuma, I don't know how they're going to. I would maybe distance learning, and giving people access to the internet could be a big step in that direction. And Africa is becoming very, very wired. So yeah. Ed?
You mentioned demographics at the end, and some countries whose populations either have begun to shrink or will in the not-too-distant future, and some in very significant ways. And you mentioned a few, but there are several other countries that are in this
Absolutely.
very similar position. Are any countries doing any? And that also, to your point, has very severe longer-term consequences. Do you see any countries doing anything to respond to that?
Well, one of the issues is, of course, fertility in developed nations. And there is an indisputable link between the length of the number of years of education a woman has and the number of children she has or doesn't have.
It's like inverse.
It's inverse. So places like Singapore, they are doing things to encourage people to have children. But let's look at Japan. When I was there for the G7 meetings, I went and talked to a bunch of people, about this problem. And then I talked to a bunch of mothers. And they said, why would we have another kid? Because, guess what? It's so expensive to have children. And I didn't realize this, even though I went to a Japanese high school, I did not realize that even public education, secondary education in Japan is not free. So they have to save up for high school and college. And so I mentioned it to people. I said, why don't you just make that free? But yeah, that would be a huge help to encourage people to have. But there are all these, it's really hard to change those behaviors. They're very sticky. Yeah, so I don't know of a good example of anybody doing the right thing. I mean, I had 3 kids, so what? I did my job.
You did your part.
Okay. Yes? Yes.
I may not have heard you correctly, but did you say that if you said, in fact, that the classical economists did not see the crisis coming,
Yes.
You mean that they didn't see the date, the exact date in which it would occur?
No.
Or whether it would occur at all?
At all. At all. And they'll all say that they didn't get it. And even Alan Greenspan said he couldn't understand. When he's a mathematician, a PhD mathematician. He could not understand all the derivatives and how those were calculated. He didn't get it. But the people who sometimes it's smart to say you're not smart. And I went with my husband to his local bank in Vermont, and he asked the bank, did you buy any of these things? And that people in Norway bought and all this. And they said, those guys came from wherever, Goldman Sachs or something, and they explained it to us, but we couldn't understand it. So we told them we didn't, and we didn't buy any. So, yeah.
May I have a follow-up question?
Sure.
Why did you not include, when you talk about productivity, why didn't you include education in your discussion on the stagnation in productivity?
Well, so what do you mean, lack of education or innovation in education?
I would say just plain, I work in industrial automation, and industrial training is my forte. We're still struggling to try to figure out how to use technologies from the early 1950s. I'm talking about computerized machine tools.
Right.
Because of lack of education, I would say.
Training.
Well, not just training. I can train someone very quickly. but they're not educated to absorb that training.
Right. It's a huge question. It's a really important question. And, you know, in this country, if I look at it from an economic point of view, part of that is because how we fund education in this country, which is unlike any place on earth, through local property taxes. So naturally, if you live in a nice neighborhood, you get a better education if you can equate a better education with more funding, which there's probably a good correlation there. And if you live in a lousy neighborhood, you're going to get a lousy education. So in all other countries in the world, that is nationalized and everybody has the same budget, and it's a great creator of a better average. We're really good at producing the really, really smart people.
Right.
But, you know, I think to create productivity, it would be better to have overall everybody have
Yeah, if I can clarify that. Many of your very basic level factory workers are very smart. Clearly. They haven't had access to that issue. They
Right.
didn't go to Lake Forest High School.
Right, yeah, so they didn't have the opportunity.
Right.
So it's really what your question is about, opportunity of education.
Well, it's opportunity, but my question was, why hadn't you included education in the issue of the stagnation of productivity?
I think it was just one of many things I probably didn't include. But I think that also I have a kind of question about education myself, which is if you go to Silicon Valley, a lot of the people there don't have college degrees, for example. And, you know, and I talked to my son about that, and he said, well, because if you stop to go to college, you know, the things, they're not being taught. The things that we need to do, they're not teaching them. There's no place to go. This is evolving too fast for what is always a very conservative part of any society, education. So the world's going forward, and education is lagging, like regulation. Yeah. Yes?
You mentioned early on about large multinational corporations being more powerful than many countries, which I agree with, and I think part of the reason is because they only serve one constituency, which is themselves.
Right.
So what are they going to do with that power? And is there any way that we can check that power? Because if they're only serving themselves, then by definition they're not serving society as a whole.
Right.
So what direction do you think that will take us, and is there any way to stop it?
Well, those are exactly the questions that Luigi Zingales talks about in his paper. So if this is true, then what's it going to be? Taxation, regulation? How are we going to make sure that corporations don't just act in the best interests of their shareholders and their employees, but in the best interests of the whole society? And I don't think there's that's a really profound question. Very important
So what's
question.
the name of the person who wrote the paper?
Zingales, Zingales, Luigi, yeah, U of C. You'll find the paper, or you'll find it on my website if you just Google his name. Yeah. Yes?
I'm wondering about factors that might be behind. You indicated that Africa is going to become a data center, but India is now a data center. And what's going to cause the switch, besides having these underground or undersea cables going to Africa, unless the educational level of the Africans increase, or are they going to be bringing people from India in to set up the centers?
Well, data centers, data centers can be automated, and there's not that much human intervention that's necessary, but the simple answer to your question is physics, the laws of physics, which are the immutable laws of the universe. So, for example, Australia is really disadvantaged in the internet world because you can't go faster than the speed of light, and when you send high-speed transactions, you cannot do those between Australia and the United States. It's just too far away. So, you know, people pay for what's called co-location. If you're a high-frequency trading firm, you're going to pay big bucks to be next to the CME because those tiny little bits of time that we cannot imagine matter when it comes to transactions. Australia is off the charts. India is too far away. Yeah. To the places that are. You think that it's instantaneous. It's not. Yeah. Yes?
One of the statements you made, I think I got this right, is that an abundance of trade does not necessarily prevent war. And I wonder if the inverse of that is also true. So if you don't have very much trade, do you have a weaker barrier against war? And why I'm asking that.
Had never thought of that.
Well, why I'm asking that is if a nation doesn't have a very good balance of trade and somebody places sanctions upon sanctions against them, what's the incentive to behave?
There you have North Korea.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
Exactly. Sanctions. Yeah, that's for next month. And by the way, I'll let Bruce Cummings handle it. Yeah. And he's a terrific, terrific expert in that area. I think you'll have a wonderful time listening to him. Yeah?
To build on the previous question about the corporate comment about corporate control of policy and what have you. You didn't mention, and I would like your thoughts on, is there's about 35% of money is indexed, which means it's all of the above.
Passive trading, yeah.
But about 20 to 25%, depending on where you are in the world, is sustainable investing streams. So in other words, investors are using their pocketbook. Shareholders are saying, we want you to do this, not that. They're influencing through proxies and stuff like that.
Right.
Even though that's going backwards in time to $1, one vote rather than one person, one vote.
Right.
Do you see the power of sustainable investing being a tool to possibly keep more corporations in check to meet a social agenda?
Yes, possibly. And in places like Sweden, it has acted that way. Actually, it's very important. And there are studies that show that when you invest in a sustainable company, that your returns are actually higher on average. So if the market rewards that, people are going to keep doing it. But if the market doesn't reward it, they're going to vote with their pocketbooks, right? Yeah. No, I think it's a very interesting question. And also the point about passive trading, I think it's like this big pendulum. And so right now, there's all kinds of automated, passive, not a human being involved in the trading. But once signals go another way and everybody, panics, I think there'll be a switch back to more active investing, involving people and, knowing companies and so forth. But that's going to take years to get back. Yeah. Yes?
You know what, I was also wondering, I was thinking a lot, piggybacking on what the gentleman said about productivity, was thinking about, certain outliers, who have been fierce in terms of like changing our economy, whether it be people like Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and just talking about like people like that, and what defines an outlier. And a lot of times when they were born, when they went to school, and how all the stars aligned.
Right.
So I just want to mention that aspect.
Right, it's really true. And what I find very interesting is, I had mentioned technology can solve problems like medical. Well, part of medical is nutrition, right? And Bill Gates has invested in this company, I think in St. Louis, that creates meat in the laboratory. So it sounds yucky, but I guess if you think of real meat, it can sound yucky too, right? So, so what kind of a difference would that make in CO2 emissions and methane and global warming if suddenly we're able to access our protein through other means? So I think those kind of people are always thinking ahead, is my point.
Right.
Yeah. And hopefully they'll fuel the next revolution too.